Well, friends, it's always a pleasure to explore the concept of monotheism with you as presented both in the Old Testament and the Quran. As we know, the Old Testament is foundational to Judaism and early Christianity. And so we need to look at how it contrasts with other religious texts, and especially in this talk with the Quran. For those of you that are not familiar with the Quran, it's a 7th century text that claims continuity with the message of the Old Testament and also parts of the New Testament. While it claims these things, though, we need to focus on some key points. So for the talk this afternoon, I really thought to make sure to cover a lot of ground. So you're going to need to stick with me as I run through some of these concepts and while I ask these questions. So let me tell you what we're going to do. First, it's important to examine how monotheism is defined. Next, I will plot the nuances of both the Quran and the Old Testament and how it explains it. And then lastly, I will compare the similarities and differences. And so what we will do then is this, we will then conclude with a final reflection on the implications of these distinctions. So it's very important for us to do. So let me start off by defining monotheism, because we hear this all the time, and I believe it is a necessary starting point. To properly engage with the concept of monotheism, especially in the Old Testament and the Quran, we must first define what it means when we speak about the word monotheism. Notably, we need to understand that there is no word in the Hebrew Bible that directly translates to monotheism as an absolute singularity. Now, it might even shock you if you hear that even in the Quran, the concept of Tawheed conveys the idea of unification rather than mere numerical oneness. Now, the term monotheism in itself is relatively a relative modern linguistic development emerging, believe it or not, in the 17th century by a scholar by the name of Henry Moore. And he was an English philosopher and theologian, and he coined the term around 1660 to describe specifically the belief in one God, but in a numerical way. So he took the word monos, which comes from the Greek, which means one, and the word theos, which comes from God. And so he put the two words together and he started using the word monotheism. However, monotheism in and of itself obviously also carries a very deep philosophical and theological implication that we need to understand is beyond simple arithmetic. Herman Cohen, he's a scholar, argued that the emphasis when we speak of God's through the terms of monotheism is rather to look at his uniqueness. And in German, he speaks of the Eensgezindheid. And he says we should rather not focus on God's numerical oneness, which we will speak of as Eenheid. And so he challenged us to move beyond purely numerical definitions and divine singularity when we define this term. I would just like to make it very obvious that obviously the concept of monotheism is very relevant to both the earliest Jewish and Muslim communities in describing what their understanding of God was. So we need to define it fairly and in its time. So let me start off and just say, neither the Old Testament believers nor the earliest Muslims had explicit categories to explain core tenets like, for instance, God's unity or his essence or the attributes evident within their texts. So what did they do? Well, they had to develop, they had to reflect, and they had to inform, and they had to make deductions and describe these essential categories from their respective texts, and they had to inform themselves when they explicated their faith. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to briefly discuss the Israelite religion and how they understood their central belief in the one God. So quickly going to speak about how we trace monotheistic trends, especially in the Israelite religion. Okay, so Dr. Theophile J. Meek, a scholar at the University of Toronto, started and he asserted that the earliest Israelite religion was not strictly monotheistic, but rather he would speak of monolatrous. And he recognized that there was in the Jewish conception of God the understanding that there was the existence of other deities. But while demanding exclusive worship, they understood that the God of the Hebrew scriptures were the one that placed on them the demand to worship him alone. He says that this view aligns with the scholarly consensus that ancient Israelites and their theological development involved a gradual transition from what we know as being monolatrous as what we could perceive to be a numerical oneness. And so it culminated in the prophetic literature and later Jewish thought. Another Old Testament scholar by the name of Helmer Ringren, this is a Swedish scholar of the Old Testament, observed very similarly that Yahweh, as Israel's confederate God under the Mosaic covenant, held a unique position as the sole deity. And he says, despite the broader Near Eastern polytheistic context around Israel, the Israeli religious identity was shaped by an exclusive devotion to Yahweh. And so in their pursuit and in their understanding of full monotheism as we have it today, the Israelite theology matured. So and though the explicit numerical monotheism was absent in the pre-exilic period, these scholars recognize an incipient monotheism within the Israelite theology that arose. And they stipulate three things, which they say in and of themselves showed us exactly what the earliest Jewish people believed about Yahweh. And so they said these three things are Yahweh is identified early as the creator of the heavens and the earth, and that naturally implies that he is the supreme authority. They also realize, secondly, that Yahweh is repeatedly described as the greatest of all gods. And then thirdly, the Israelite religion uniquely demands exclusive worship of Yahweh, which logically extends to the belief that there is only one true God. So these elements, creation, supremacy, and exclusive worship, formed the foundation for Israel's eventual assertion about what it means when they spoke about full monotheism. Let me just quickly give you a quote of N.T. Wright, who speaks about the nature of early Jewish monotheism. And he says the following. He says, there is no suggestion that monotheism, or even praying the Shema, had anything to do with the numerical analysis of the inner being of Israel's God himself. He affirms later in another volume that he wrote that with the rise of Christianity and obviously the influence of Hellenized philosophy, the Jews in the second temple period and subsequent centuries reinterpreted monotheism as the numerical oneness of the divine being. So he adds further, the monotheism was never in our period as an inner analysis or of the inner being of the one God. It was always a way of saying, frequently at great risk, that our God is the true God and your gods are worthless idols. And this is important. When we look at the Jewish identity and the understanding of what Jews believe when they speak about the oneness of God, we can clearly see that the intention even of the Old Testament authors affirm Yahweh's distinctiveness, rather than trying to communicate his absolute numerical unity or identity. Now, these things are prevalent within the text, but the main claim of these authors was always to describe the exclusiveness of Yahweh. And so, when we read an important passage in the Old Testament, for instance, like the Shema in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, that says quite clearly, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God and Yahweh is one. It speaks directly of God's exclusivity amongst the other gods. Dr. Michael Bird also writes quite sterlingly and quite clearly. And he says, when we reflect upon the Old Testament scriptures, we can see that monotheism entails monolatry. That is the worship of the one true God to the exclusion of others, making up the substance of Jewish monotheism. Another two scholars by the name of Dr. James Dunn and John Robertson also write in their commentary on Deuteronomy when they speak about the Shema. They reflect quite clearly and say, when the Old Testament writers actually try to explicate their understanding of Yahweh, they most likely refer to Yahweh's uniqueness. This is very important for us. So when we look at the Jewish understanding of what it means when we speak of monotheism, we need to understand it and interpret it in such a light. So what about the Muslim conception of the oneness of Allah and the understanding of the word Tawheed? So when we trace monotheistic trends in early Islam, we need to understand that the doctrine of the oneness of Allah or God is called Tawheed. And the word Tawheed comes from the Arabic root called Wahada, which means to unite or to make one. Very interesting. And Muslims claim that this doctrine is the foundational theological principle of Islam. And it is first constituted, obviously, for them in the Quran. So, first of all, let's look at the 7th century and the Quran and the early Islamic period. In the early 7th century, the concept of oneness was stated in the Quran, particularly in what is known as Surah Al-Ikhlas, that is chapter 112, ayat or verse 1 to 4. And it reads as follows. It says, "Say, He, Allah, is one. Allah is He on whom all depends. He begets not, nor is He begotten." And here it's very important. "And none is like Allah, or none is like Him." So early Islamic thought emphasizes Tawheed and the exclusivity and the absolute oneness of Allah as absolute Unitarianism, opposing both what was known as polytheism, which would be shirk, or any other form of associating partners with Allah or God. So historically, the Prophet of Islam insisted on an understanding of Allah's exclusiveness and sole devotion against what was described as the polytheistic beliefs in pre-Islamic Arabia. And the first Muslim community embraced this, of course, as their core faith. So what about later? Because I did say that when we look at the earliest Muslims, we can see that they needed to reinterpret, they needed to look at, and they needed to expound upon this concept. And so we can look at the earliest theological schools in the 8th to 10th century as Islam expanded into the 8th and 10th centuries. These scholars began to systematize their theology. There was leading debates on Tawheed and the unity of God. And let me just say, there was definitely a particular concern for Allah's attributes, or what Muslims would call the sifat of Allah. So in the 8th and 9th century, there's a group by the name of the Mu'tazili, and they stress God's absolute oneness, and they reject distinct attributes to avoid implying this multiplicity, which they would believe would be in God if God was actually defined through his attributes as well. Only in the 10th century, the Ash'arites, led by Al-Ash'ari, argued that Allah's attributes are real but inseparable from his essence. And so they would say that Tawheed connects both very meaningfully his qualities and also his essence. Later on, we also find that there is a contribution in the 10th to the 13th century through the philosophical and schools of Islam, and specifically through certain Sufis. For the sake of time, I can only go into the most notable, which I think is in the 12th century, which is a scholar by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah. And he was really the first to divide Tawhid into 3 levels. His student, Ibn Qayyim, expanded on it. But if you really want to define what Muslims then try to communicate when they spoke of the oneness of Allah, they use these categories. So first of all, they spoke of Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. And Tawheed al-Rububiyyah basically means that there is a oneness of lordship, where they assert Allah to be the sole creator. Then the second category would be Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, which means the oneness of worship, where they affirm only Allah as being the one worthy to receive any form of worship. And then there's also thirdly a category called Tawheed al-Asma wa al-Sifat, which means that there is a oneness of the names and the attributes of Allah. So it emphasizes Allah's unique attributes. And then later, and we can discuss why this happened, there seems to be a 4th level of Tawheed that was added. And I think this is because of the political institution which Islam became, called Tawheed al-Hakamiyah, which is a oneness of sovereignty. And it's sometimes included in certain instances where Muslims explain what they mean when they speak of Tawheed. And this simply highlights Allah's exclusive right to legislate and rules, and especially through the later caliphs. And if you want to go through quite laborious reading, we can see quite clearly that they truly believe that Allah enacts His will through specific leaders, and therefore this fourth level of Tawheed is a way in which we uphold the unity of Allah by enforcing Allah's rule through specific individuals. So now, friends, I hope you're still with me. That was a lot to process. So when comparing the Old Testament and the Quranic conceptions of God distinctiveness, we can clearly see a perceived commonality in the description of what is assumed about the basic understanding of what it means when both communities speak about God. So there are commonalities between the Quranic and the Old Testament conceptions of God when we measure them and when we look at them. So let me give you those distinctives. And again, when we speak about, there's a lot of discussions going around where different scholars say Christianity and Islam, for instance, have similar deities. Usually this is where they stop. And so they say, well, the commonalities are found both in the Old Testament and the Quran that depicts that Yahweh or Allah is, and number one, they would speak of the sole creator and ruler, the greatest conceivable being, and the sole custodian worthy of worship. Those three things are usually what is given to us to show us quite clearly that there is a continuity or a similarity and the perceived conception of both communities' deities that we find in the Old Testament and the Quran. But at this point, we should also conclude and say that as students who fear God and who fear His word, and also understand we need to speak about everything that both the Bible and the Quran says, obviously, we must also acknowledge the need to explore the differences, particularly when comparing the Old Testament conception of Yahweh with the Quranic understanding of Allah. So let me quickly speak to you about the differences between the Old Testament conceptions of God and why we cannot adequately explain and say that the conception of God, especially when we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, has an absolute bearing of unity. So number one, I'm going to speak about a personhood, or what it means when we speak about person. Now, why do I go down this route? Well, undoubtedly, there is a personal interaction between Allah and His created order. We can see, for instance, that in Al-Hadid, this is chapter 57 of the Quran, ayat 4, it speaks and it says that Allah is with you wherever you are. Another one that is quite popular is found in Surah Al-Kahf, that is chapter 50 of the Quran, in ayat 16. Muslims love this. They say that Allah is closer to you than your jugular vein. And so there's this perceived understanding that there is a personal interaction between Allah and His creation. But it's interesting to note that even though the Muslim devotee is instructed to ascertain a certain knowledge of Allah through His revealed names and attributes, the creator-creature distinction remains very clearly defined. And this is very important. Whenever we speak to Muslims, we can see that one of the major differences, especially when we measure what we see about God in the Old Testament and God in the Quran, is that the interaction in the Quran between Allah and His creatures, and in the Old Testament between Yahweh and His people, lacks agency and personhood. Now, let me explain to you exactly what I mean. When we look at Allah, we can see that Allah's distinctiveness is very different to what we see when God declares His distinctiveness in the Old Testament. When we look at the Allah of the Quran, He's absolutely, or I should rather say, ultimately transcendent. Now, again, I've read to you Surah Al-Ikhlas, that is chapter 112, but let me remind you of ayat 4, that declares that whenever we conceive Allah, none is like unto Him. Okay? So nothing that we conceive about Allah and Him being a personal deity is comparable when we conceive about Him. Now, we need to say, obviously, when we look at the Old Testament, when we speak about God, there's a lot of things that for us is beyond comprehension. but we are speaking about what it means when Allah reveals himself personally and as person. Okay, so Dr. Ronald Nicholson says emphatically, and I want to read this to you. It's quite lengthy, but I think it will explain exactly what I'm trying to communicate. He says the word shakhs, meaning a person, is not applicable to Allah, though it occurs with reference to him in tradition. Allah is nowhere described by any term that implies for Muslims what the word person implies for us Christians. Muslims, for the most part, have always conceived that Allah is personal only as far as personal relations are allowed to exist between worshipper and his God. Allah is entirely different from all other created beings. Now, maybe another quotation from the scholar Muhammad Saleh Zarpur will even emphasize the point I'm trying to make a little bit more clearer. He says, from the viewpoint of many Muslims, God is not a person. Consequently, if the doctrine of personhood of God is indefensible, so is literalism. So even if one denies that God is a person, one can still accept that he has personal manifestations and attributes. But listen to the last part. But the Quran, as including God's literal words, without holding the view that God is a person. So, what do we communicate with when we actually try to distinguish what it means when we speak about Allah? To be clear, there is no strict difference between conceiving Allah as being personal and when we look at what we can find, for instance, in Christianity. When we look at Christianity, it describes God as person and personal. When we look at the Allah of the Quran, we can see that the Allah of the Quran is perceived to be personal, but there is no personhood in him. So, why is this important? Well, especially in the Old Testament, we can see quite clearly that there is something comparable that exists between Yahweh and his devotees. So there can be some form of, or some element of union or true mutuality. And Dr. Nicholson agrees when he says some elements of likeness without some degree of moral affinity is necessary when we actually speak of our relationship with Yahweh. See, in the Old Testament theology that Christians reflect back on as well, it is primary for us to understand that Yahweh created man in his image and in his likeness, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. It is so we can commune with God. We can love God. We can actually have a relationship with him, and we can apprehend his perfect will. We can apprehend these demands of holiness. But the transcendent Allah never condescends himself in his creation, nor is there any form of mutuality when we speak of Allah's relationship with his devotees. So, Allah is perceived to be personal, but there is no personhood when it comes to Allah. Now, how does it impact our way in which we describe the theology that we hold dear? I think Alistair McGrath sums this up quite nicely, and he gives us a central theme of the Old Testament and shows us how it falls apart if we do not hold that God is personal and person in our relationship with him. And listen to what he says. He says the great biblical theme of promise and fulfillment is ultimately based upon a personal relationship. One of the great themes which accommodates or dominates the Old Testament in particular is that of a covenant between God and people by which they mutually bind themselves to each other. So, in other words, what we see, it is necessary for us to understand that God reaches out as person and being personal for us to have that mutual relationship in unison with this covenantal God. Especially in the Old Testament, we can see quite clearly how God enacts his will, how God comes to us in this personal manner, but also as person to create this unity and this covenant relationship with his people. So that is, first of all, when we reflect upon monotheism in Islam and monotheism in the Old Testament, a huge difference on how we look at both our texts. Secondly, here's another difficulty that we need to consider, especially when we reflect about on what is revealed in the Old Testament and what is revealed in the Quran. And that is basically the knowledge that we can have of Yahweh and Allah. Now, the Old Testament prioritizes pressing into God or Yahweh and pursuing what he revealed about himself. Let me give you a few scriptures. For instance, there's a psalm that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And we all know this, Psalm 46, verse 10. There is this longing to be made known, but also to be known from God. In the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 11, verse 32, another passage of scripture says that the people who do know their God shall be strong and do great exploits. Look at that emphasis on the people who do know their God. Let me just say, this is not just an approximation of knowing that God is the sole divinity amongst the nations. No, this speaks of an intimate personal relationship where the devotee can relate to this individual person called God, and he can know him personally. And this is what the Old Testament understanding, therefore, of Yahweh is when it is described that he is known or that he is a known entity. Now, listen to what Gerald Bray mentions when he speaks about especially the possibility of knowing Yahweh. He says the following. He says, to be Christian is to believe that it's possible to know Yahweh. More than that, it is to believe that Yahweh has made it possible for us to know him by revealing himself to us. To believe in God, a Christian would say, is to know God. And if we know God, then it's inevitable that he will change our lives and we will become the most central part, he will become the most central part of our life and experience. So, friends, this is so important for us to reflect upon what we can conceive of and what we can say when we know God. Also, from a philosophic position, we can say that a personality demands personhood and personhood community. Professor Keith Ward writes the following when reflecting on especially who God is. And he says, a conscious mind expresses its inner nature in conscious love relationship with minds that are truly other than it. So we declare, we say, yes, when we look at Yahweh, Yahweh is other, but there is still a commonality. And Yahweh is not completely unknowable, but is a supreme mind that can be truly known and made and can also be loved by creatures. I think Dr. Ward is right in this. And Dr. Ward's statement would affirm that what can be deduced about Yahweh in the Old Testament revelation is compatible with what we can say and think about what we can know about Yahweh's inner life. And so in the Old Testament, there seems to be a balance between this transcendence and immanence. Not so in the Quran. Let me give you a few Muslim scholars and exactly what they say when they reflect upon this reality of Allah being personal but not person. Dr. Fadlo Shihadi, incredibly amazing scholar a Muslim scholar on Al-Ghazali. After analyzing Al-Ghazali's arguments about especially the transcendence of Allah, he concludes the following, and listen to this quote. He says, Allah is utterly unknowable. For according to Ghazali, things are known by their likeness, and what is utterly unlike what is known to man cannot be known. Allah would have to be unknowable, completely unknowable, not only to the man in the street, but to the prophets and the mystics as well. This is a conclusion that Ghazali states very explicit. Why am I saying and quoting a scholar that quotes Al-Ghazali? Well, friends, because Ghazali is probably one of the greatest influences when it speaks about the modern day conception about what and who Allah is. The majority of Muslims will uphold this and say, yes, we need to create that distinction where we say we cannot ultimately know God. Here's another colossal thinker. Islamic scholar Al-Faruqi says this quite clearly. He says, he, Allah, does not reveal himself to anyone in any way. Allah reveals only his will. Christians talk about the revelation of Yahweh himself, by Yahweh and of Yahweh. But that is the great difference between Christianity and Islam. Friends, do you see now why there's such an urgency for us to make this God known to Muslims? Because they cannot know him. And that is the second problem with the Muslim conception or understanding of Allah. Thirdly and lastly, and trust me, there's a few, I only chose three, but the last problem with the Quranic conception of monotheism seems to concern itself with the revealed attributes mentioned in the Quran and their differences, especially when we look at Yahweh and the Old Testament. So let me speak to you quickly about the correspondence of the attributes when we look at both the Old Testament conception of God and the Quranic conception of God. We all know this beautiful passage of scripture in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 to 7, that says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave you guilty or unpunished. Beautiful scripture that gives us a descriptive understanding of what it means when we speak about the understanding of what we attribute to Yahweh. Now listen to John Frame. He makes an important note when he writes the following. He says the following. He says, Yahweh's names and revealed attributes tell us what he truly is at the heart of his being. There's nothing more fundamental about him that could call his revealed nature into question. Such biblical terms as holiness, goodness, and love, and eternally expressed, these eternally express Yahweh's essence. Listen to this. They tell us what Yahweh really is. Okay, my friends. Then we need to ask ourselves, what about the conception of Allah? Majid Fakhri, who is a scholar, writes about this tension between two very prominent Islamic groups very early on in the Muslim dispensation. And he writes about certain dominant views which arose in Islam. And he speaks specifically about the theologian in Islam called Al-Ash'ari and what arose as being popular in Islam when describing the attributes of Allah. Okay, so he says the following. He says the essential attributes of Allah, such as knowledge, power, and life, according to him, subsists in Allah's essence, his that eternally, but cannot be said to be identical with the essence or distinction from it, since the mode of predication name of Allah is unknown. So what is he saying? Another intellectual Muslim writes, Sirajuddin Ali, in the 11th century, in his wonderful book called Imali. He reflects upon this and he says the following, just to make it a little bit easier for us. He says the attributes of Allah are not Allah himself, but neither are they distinct or independent from his being. His attributes are manifestations of him and his being and his works, and they are eternal, qadim, but they are also impersonal. Well, so in other words, when we look at this understanding of what is revealed about the attributes of Allah, Allah can attribute certain attributes to himself, but he's above them. Okay, so these attributes like love, like I said, some of these attributes that are mentioned, especially in the Quran when it speaks of his holiness, these attributes are manifestations of his will. But we always need to remember that Allah is above them. Okay, so the God of the Old Testament and his revealed nature seems to be succinct with that which is the script of what he reveals us about himself. So Old Testament theology dares to ascribe to Yahweh the revealed attributes, saying it is descriptive of his essential being. But what we perceive then as the attributes of Allah does not reflect in any way the bare essence of Allah. Now that's mind-bending, Because how do you really ascribe to Allah something if he's not that? And that is why another Muslim thinker, Dr. Syed Muhammad Reza Jazi, cautions Muslims in his excellent book, The Most Beautiful Names of Allah in the Quran, that they should study the names and attributes of Allah to strengthen their relationship with Allah. But he also mentions that, and I quote, Muslim theologians should discuss the names and attributes of Allah, but they should refrain from describing Allah's essence. There's a Christian thinker, very sharp thinker by the name of Duncan B. MacDonald, and he points to this problem. He says the following. He says, when speaking of Allah's qualities, that is his attributes like mercy that he applies to himself, the devotee has no right to take them, that is these qualities, as descriptive or being descriptive qualities of the inner nature of Allah. So they do not throw any light on Allah's nature, of course, and you may describe his action, but you're not allowed to describe it as his essential nature. My friends, let me ask you, what does this do to what can be said about morality? If we say that morality is a deduction made from what is revealed by God himself, if we say morality is a deduction made by what God revealed and what God revealed in his attributes about himself, what can Muslims say when they speak about the attributes of Yahweh in light of what they see in Allah? There is no comparison. So friends, there are important questions that we need to ask whenever we speak about the conception of what it means when we speak about monotheism in the Old Testament and Tawheed, and when we speak about the Old Testament conception of Yahweh. And let me just say, when we look at our understanding of Yahweh, we can see quite clearly that the description of Yahweh in the Old Testament is sufficient. The word sufficiency we should not be ashamed of. It's a word that we hold dearly to because we see that that is descriptively of what we can speak of when we speak of the divine. So, in conclusion, even though the Quran and the Old Testament can be categorized as being monotheistic, it is important to note that the exclusive worship of God played a significant role in the early historical revelation of these faiths. And while there are certain similarities, there are also stark differences. And as I've pointed out, these differences provide us with an opportunity for us to share our faiths more effectively. And so I leave you with that. I hope this stirred your heart. I hope this brings you to a place where whenever you speak to a Muslim, you can adequately speak to a Muslim about the revelation of both this God in the Old Testament and their God in the Quran, showing them exactly that the God of the Christian scriptures is sufficient in and of himself. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.